Well, I would like to welcome everybody here to the World Salon Digital Fireside Series. This one is titled Safeguarding Education, the Federal Task Force Initiative. And I'm just grateful to have the opportunity to be here and discuss this important topic. So the first thing that I wanted to do is have our speakers and I can have us introduce ourselves so you know who is with you this evening. My name is Alana Redstone. I'm an associate professor in the sociology department at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I'm the author of most recently of a book called The Certainty Trap, and I work on sort of solving the problem of contempt in political discourse. And I will turn it over to Professor Kerry Nelson to introduce himself. Professor Nelson, do you want to introduce yourself? Okay, while we're figuring that out, Sean Cavani, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, my name is Sean Kevany. I'm
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I'm the acting general counsel at the Department of Health and Human Services. I've been a lawyer since 2002. I was graduated from University of Tulsa, Oxford University, and then University of Texas. After that, I clerked on the Fifth Circuit, U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. And then I was an honors hire at the Department of Justice, where I was in the Civil Rights Division for 16 years before coming over to HHS.
Wow, all right. I'm just going to turn it back over to Professor Nelson and see if he is there. Kerry Nelson, are you there? Can you hear us? I know he was just with us, so he's not far. I'm going to give him another minute. Okay,
It needs to go out and I'm on TV.
Oh, we can hear you now, Professor.
Yep, we can hear you. Do you want to introduce yourself? Professor Nelson? Okay, I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So Professor Nelson, when you're ready, we would love to have you introduce yourself. Why don't we start with a question, sort of a general question. Okay, so sorry, Sean, how did you say your last name again? Kevany?
Kevany, that's right.
Kevany. Okay, so I want to ask you a question to sort of get our discussion started, which is, how do federal agencies like HHS collaborate with educational institutions to ensure compliance with anti-discrimination policies? And what legal or regulatory challenges do schools face in implementing these initiatives effectively? That's quite a question.
Yeah, that's quite a question. The first part is I can speak to very easily. There
Okay.
are certain federal civil rights statutes that are called spending clause statutes. So they're tied to federal recipient of federal funds.
Uh-huh.
So in other words, they're not tied to like the Commerce Clause or Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. Rather, they impose civil rights obligations only when an entity in the context of this conversation, educational entities accept federal funding. And the biggest statutes are Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin, and Title IX, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. Um, the astute legal listeners among you will note that I said Title VI prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin. And as many folks know, there's currently a federal task force to address anti-Semitism in higher education. Title VI has been construed by multiple administrations, and most recently by the Trump administration and the Biden administration before it, to apply to certain types of protected classifications that are considered to fall within the national origin language of Title VI. That would include anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, and related forms of discrimination in federally funded programs and activities. So that's the basic legal framework.
Can I just ask a clarifying question before you go to the
Yes,
second
of course.
part of that? Is that the piece of legislation that was drawn upon in the recent, I mean, within all the headlines about Columbia University and funding being withheld? Is that the piece that you're talking about?
So no. So they're yes and no. It's a little more complicated than that. So those are the two spending clause civil rights statutes that Columbia and other universities that take federal money have to comply with. HHS, as well as other parts of the federal government, also issue grants, and those grants are subject to policy determinations by the head of the grant-making agency.
Okay.
So in the case of Columbia University, HHS is, I believe, the largest federal funder of programs at Columbia University. HHS gives approximately $3.3 billion to Columbia.
Wow.
So that money comes with the civil rights ties, the requirements of Title VI and Title IX. It also has to be used for the scientific purposes for which the grants were made. And in this case, with respect to Columbia, the director of NIH determined that an atmosphere of anti-Semitism on campus is not conducive to good scientific research. So certain grant money was withheld from Columbia pursuant to a policy decision by NIH.
Mm-hmm.
Separately, HHS, the Department of Education, OCR, are investigating whether Columbia violated Title VI in addition to having funds withheld by NIH. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's a level of understanding that's of sort of the bureaucratic layer that is beyond something I'm familiar with, but it does make sense. Yeah, your answer makes sense. I think you wanted to respond to the second part of the question about what legal or regulatory challenges do schools face in implementing these initiatives effectively?
So, I'm not an administrator. I've always been in civil rights enforcement my whole career. So it's a little outside of my bailiwick to speak to what challenges the university administrators would have.
Mm.
But from my perspective, they need to make sure that they are complying with good university governance, that if it's a state university, that they're complying with the First Amendment, and that they're also complying with the non-discrimination prohibitions of Title VI.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a member of the task force, we're very cognizant of all those different obligations that universities have. And in fact, in a recent letter that we sent to Columbia University, we made sure to point out that the reforms that we are hoping Columbia University will make in response to the task force's activities can be made in a way that ensures the protection of students and faculty members' First Amendment rights.
Mm-hmm.
And we've made very clear that the federal government does not want to be in a position where it is dictating curriculum decisions. It really wants to just be in a position where it is protecting the core civil rights that the universities, in accepting federal funds, have agreed to protect.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. That's helpful clarification. I want to, before I sort of answer my own question, I want to just check back with Professor Nelson and see if he is available to see if he has rejoined us to introduce himself.
Yeah, I think that I'm audible now.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, can you turn your video on? We would love to see
Turn
you.
it off?
On, it wasn't on.
Ah.
Oh, I don't have, okay, someone says it's on. I don't have, it's not on for me, but let's keep going.
I think it's
Jonathan,
on.
I don't see, I just
I
see a
can see you.
snapshot of you,
Yeah.
but that's okay. Go ahead and introduce yourself. That would be great.
Sure. Yeah, I've been a faculty member at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I came here first in 1970, and I've been teaching since then. I'm now emeritus, but I'm very active. Uh, First of all, in writing and publishing about anti-Semitism and about the Arab-Israeli conflict, and about the impact of anti-Semitism on campus. I'm just published my 7th book on that subject, and I also work in various organizations. I'm co-chair of the local University of Illinois organization, Faculty for Academic Freedom and Against Anti-Semitism, and I'm chair of a national group, the Alliance for Academic Freedom. I'm a former president of the American Association of University Professors. So I've been interested in the intersection between academic freedom and the rights of minorities, including Jewish minorities, well, I guess for decades. And I guess that's a sufficient introduction.
No, that's great. That's very helpful. And we're grateful to have you here. So let me pose to you a question. Given your extensive work on academic freedom and higher education policy, how can universities effectively address anti-Semitism on campus while safeguarding open inquiry and protecting faculty and student speech rights?
Sure. Let's give just a little background. Higher education had a wake-up call in the months following October 7, 2023, about the presence of anti-Semitism on our campuses. Prior to that moment, it really was quite common to find faculty members, intelligent faculty members, saying that anti-Semitism was not a fundamental problem. And that's counter to a lot of pretty solid statistical research that shows that for Jewish students and faculty on campus, and this goes back quite some years, anti-Semitism is a recognized and recurrent problem. But it became more difficult, I think, for those claiming that it wasn't a problem in the wake of October 7, 2023. Part of what was surprising about that moment in time and the months that have followed, is that the hostility to Israel that was so visible in the academy surfaced almost immediately after news of the Hamas assault on the communities near Gaza became widely known. That was by the next day, by October 8th, there were faculty members and student groups applauding the Hamas assault, almost as if they had to know it beforehand, which I actually don't think they did. But they reacted very, very quickly. It was to be expected that hostility toward Israel would surface and intensify as soon as Israel began a ground assault in Gaza. But when 30 student groups at Harvard late on the 7th of October declared that Israel was wholly responsible for what had happened, that was a surprise. One just thought that that was going to take a while for that hostility to coalesce, because in each of the previous conflicts with Gaza, it had taken a while for that hostility to really take form. So here we saw it as an immediate effect. And it couldn't come from nothing. That is, you really have to conclude that there had to be a reservoir, a deep reservoir of feeling for that immediate response to have happened. And so I think that gave all of us, I think we all of us, including myself, who believed that there was a problem of anti-Semitism, but I decided that it was a lot worse than I had imagined. And that's true for many of us, that, in an odd way, just as the Israeli Defense Forces misjudged Hamas's capacity and Hamas's malice, I think we misjudged the level of anti-Semitism in our midst. So we had to really begin to rethink these things. Having said that, having said that higher education got a wake-up call, I think it's also true that there's a large component of higher education that's now ready to go back to sleep. The wake-up call was over. Let's take a nap, which I think is not going to help. And one of the structural or psychological facts that influences that desire to go back to sleep is that our campuses, on the issue of anti-Semitism, on the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, are incredibly divided and polarized. Campus administrators don't like to take controversial actions. If everyone agrees about something, then they're happy to stand up and show what appears to be courage. But on this issue, if they fight anti-Semitism, the people who basically are taking anti-Semitic positions, whether consciously or not, are going to be unhappy with them. So they'll face conflict, they'll face criticism, and it's a no-win situation for them. And that's one of the reasons why I've come to the conclusion that this problem cannot be addressed without federal interventions. I just don't think the campuses can fix themselves. On January 16th, there was an Office of Civil Rights report on George Washington University, which happens to be a campus I've followed very closely and written a lot of words about. And one of the points in that report, which I thought was quite well done, many of the OCR reports have been careful, thoughtful investigations. They've been good work. One of the points in that report, which was, I thought, particularly significant, was a statement that if a campus is trying to decide whether a hostile climate for Jews, for Jewish students exists, the campus has to give consideration to the posts on social media that faculty members and students have made. The AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, which I was a member of the elected leadership for 23 years, for better or worse, has since 2014 taken the position that whatever a faculty member says on social media is free from any university evaluation or judgment or sanctions. You can't take issue with it. It's absolute. It's a kind of perfect First Amendment zone. It can't be evaluated professionally, and I think that that's quite insane, and that the public wouldn't understand that kind of effort to preserve, racist, anti-Semitic comments, a whole range of possible comments on social media from any kind of professional judgment. That's an example of the federal government intervening and trying to really clarify a situation and restore some sort of rationality to the campus environment. The demand letter that Sean mentioned just a few moments ago regarding Columbia, it was an interesting document. There were 9 points. 5 of the points I thought were totally reasonable. They were issues Columbia was already talking about. They were decisions Columbia was already thinking about making. And Columbia's response should have been to go ahead and say, right, glad you reminded us we should do this stuff. We will do it now. Unfortunately, Columbia didn't do that. I mean, for example, Columbia was urged in the demand document to make wearing masks on campus during demonstrations illegal by campus law. And Columbia didn't. Instead, Columbia just revived its old rule, which was, if someone demands that you identify yourself when you're wearing a mask, you have to show some ID and show who you are. That was already on the books, so they didn't bother doing anything. Of the 9 demands, I thought 2 represented things that the federal government shouldn't do. However, they represented things that Columbia itself absolutely should do. And the first of those was to put the Department of Middle East Studies into receivership. I felt for 20 years it belonged in a receivership. I've written about it repeatedly. I've done careful study of some of its faculty members. I mean, it was a blatantly anti-Semitic program that needed to have its decision-making and its personnel decisions taken out of its own hands. But I think administrative freedom and academic freedom suggests that Columbia had to reach that decision itself. It needed pressure from its own people. It needed its pressure from its graduates. It needed public pressure from people in New York and elsewhere. But I thought it was not the job of the federal government to impose that decision on Columbia. And Columbia didn't do it in any case. All Columbia did was said, well, we'll review that program and we'll review all similar programs, which is something that they do all along. So what should Columbia have done? What would help this problem? First of all, Columbia is a university, is an educational institution, and its first options, the options that it's most well positioned to institute, are educational. And so I think required training on about anti-Semitism awareness, which is something its own review board had recommended a year earlier. All campuses should have required training for everyone with a responsibility towards students. Whether you're teaching students, you're counseling students, any what's called student-facing responsibilities, all of those people should be trained annually about what anti-Semitism is, its history, and its current manifestations. That's the first thing. Unfortunately, it wasn't in the demands that the administration issued, but I think long-term, it's one of the few things that could actually help the situation. That's my first recommendation. The second would be adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. However, when you adopt it, specify you're not going to use it for disciplining people. You're going to use it to educate people. You're going to use the IHRA's 11 examples to show people how contemporary anti-Semitism operates, what examples of it are. It's a very useful educational device, and I think campuses should all adopt it and use it educationally. The third recommendation, because I'm only going to make 3, though I could offer many more, but the third priority is to begin to deal with people who teach and introduce inappropriate political convictions into their classrooms. I think that is a high priority. If you read the reports that have come out of campuses from UCLA, from Stanford, from Columbia, and other campuses around the country, you will see that when undergraduates report some of their most painful experiences of anti-Semitism, they often highlight what happened in classes from instructors, especially from graduate student instructors, which is a common practice at larger institutions, that graduate students teach a lot of courses. Sometimes they have the passion of undergraduates, and they have the power of faculty members, and it's not a good match. So I think those people who don't have tenure need to, but are introducing and imposing political views on their students in their classrooms need to be sanctioned, and in some cases they need to be let go. Because universities need to send a message that imposing political views on your students is simply unacceptable. So those are my 3 priority suggestions about what we could do. The basic academic freedom model is this. Academic freedom gives people the right to say anything they want to say, but it does not protect them from all professional consequences for saying so. If you want to say that Jews have horns, you can say that Jews have horns. But if you're a faculty member, you can face consequences for saying it. It's not an absolute protection against professional consequences for your speech.
Thank you for that's very thoughtful. Thank you for that. And I know, so I see people are putting questions in the Q&A, so we will get to that in a little bit. So absolutely, if you have questions as anyone is talking, please just put them in there. I don't know that we'll get to all of them, but we will certainly do our best. So there's one more before we get to some general questions and maybe to some of the Q&A questions. There's one more question that's posed to me, which is how can educational institutions foster an environment that effectively combats anti-Semitism while also promoting open discourse and viewpoint diversity, particularly in an era of increasing political and ideological polarization. So my thoughts on that are it's sort of a two-prong approach. And neither of which, the first is going to be very unpopular and the second might be slightly less unpopular. The first is that this idea, universities for a long time have had a de facto policy, even if it's not written down, although in some cases it's almost written down, that if somebody calls something racist, transphobic, sexist, etc., or in some other way offensive, that then needs a response, and that whether it's additional training, whether it's some kind of discipline, there's lots of sort of case examples of this over the past 15, 20 years. My sense is that has always been a bad policy. It was on a college campus, on a university campus. It can't be the case that somebody simply saying that they're offended, biased, a microaggression, whatever, by somebody is enough to then say that the person should not say it. It's just not a good policy if what you're trying to optimize for is viewpoint diversity or political diversity. And the reason for that is that it's not because you want, and we could talk about what the difference is, but it's not because you want a culture where anything goes and people can scream racial epithets at each other. It's because there are any number of statements like trans women are not women, or I think that race should not be used in admissions decisions. You could imagine any number of statements like this where somebody could say that they're offended, say that it's transphobic, racist, etc., and be sincere in that claim, and yet it's still a political position. And so my point in that is that was always a bad policy. And so after October 7th, how does this relate to anti-Semitism? You have these dueling claims about what's anti-Semitic, what's Islamophobic, all of this. And the expectation, the reasonable expectation, frankly, based on decades of practice, that the claim of anti-Semitism, the claim of Islamophobia was enough to warrant a response. And frankly, that was warranted. That was warranted because that was the precedent that had been set. That had been set repeatedly. And it was always, when I say a bad policy, I don't mean that it's intrinsically bad. I mean that it's bad if the thing that you care about is political diversity, viewpoint diversity, etc. It's a bad policy if that's what you're trying to optimize for or maximize in any sort of way. So that was always a policy that it was set, that was at odds with that goal. I think that became clear after October 7th, because the sides that were sort of making those claims were no longer, it was no longer just the progressives and the conservatives. There were splits within the left and et cetera. And so it became visible in a way that it wasn't visible before. So that's one piece, is to sort of back away from that policy, which is, again, I'm not suggesting that it's somewhere written down, although I think there have been some anti-bias initiatives that have effectively done that in practice, sort of respond to just the labeling of something as being offensive or transphobic or racist, et cetera. That's not a claim. There's a more complicated conversation to be had. That's not a claim that there aren't people who are racist, transphobic, et cetera. It's that using one person's claim about something being offensive if you're going to let that be the thing that determines whether it's warrants some kind of response, some kind of anti-bias response, then you cannot have a campus culture that prioritizes viewpoint diversity, political diversity, et cetera. You just can't. You can pick one, have one or the other. You can't have both. So that's one. The other is, I would say, and Professor Nelson sort of got to this a little bit, there is, in the ideas on campus about Israel and Gaza, one of the things that became clear, and again, this is not new, nor is it specific to Israel and Gaza, is that for decades, and I'm in a sociology department where higher education is to the left and sociology within higher education is to the left. And so this is sort of the discipline that I come from. Not sociology, higher education in general for decades has leaned into explanations that say among other things, intent doesn't matter, that this isn't new, that disparities are evidence of discrimination. It's an oversimplified worldview that actually predicts and aligns with the view that Israel is only a colonial power sort of creating, oppressing people in Gaza, etc. I'm not saying, this is not a claim that Israel is beyond reproach in any way. What I'm saying is that oversimplified worldview is something on issues around race, gender. It's something that campuses have settled for a long time. And the anti-Israel view that you see on campuses is really a sort of natural extension of that. And the way to tackle that view really requires a systemic change. And I'll give one example and then I'll stop. A systemic change on campuses about how we think about what's a politically disputed claim and what's sort of a claim about truth. And I'll give one example from my own campus and then I'll turn it back to general comments. The committee that I was on last year, which is just a courses and curriculum committee. Professor Nelson's probably been on it on the same campus. There's nothing exciting about the committee. You just sort of rubber stamp courses as instructors try to get a sort of regular course number. So the course will appear in the course catalog. The last course that we reviewed, this committee of 9 or so people, the last course that we reviewed last spring in 2024 was a course called Racism in the United States. And it was put forward by a department in the College of Arts and Sciences. And it was the course description was about systemic racism and unconscious bias and, pretty much what many of us have come to expect on a course in racism and on a college campus. And on the committee, I said, this course is fine. It makes sense to me. Like there's nothing surprising here. There's nothing unusual. I said, but it really is not a course on racism in the United States. I said, what it is it's a progressive view of racism in the United States. I said, just that's what it is. Whether you like it or not, it is a progressive view of racism in the United States. And so the course title should be brought in line with the course content. And nobody wanted to sort of take that on. I don't know. I don't want to put words in people's mouths. I don't know if they disagreed with it or whatever. What does that have to do with anti-Semitism? That's the sort of the worldview, the sort of blurring of the line between what is a politically disputed claim and what is a truth claim that is consistent with what we've seen on college campuses in the responses on the Israel-Gaza. So imagine a campus that instead of sort of settling for that, was teaching their students, when I engage on heated and contentious issues, I'm a student on campus X, I won't settle for simplistic explanations or implications that one side is good and the other evil. I'll engage clearly and explicitly with the potential disadvantages and downsides of my preferred positions. I won't make assumptions about intent. I won't assume that if everyone had the same information, they would all agree. And I'll commit to using language in a way that's precise and acknowledge when key terms mean different things to different people. That's a totally different campus culture than what most campuses have. And that is where it's very doable. That is, in my view, where we need to head. So I will, let me stop and open it up if any of our speakers want to add something.
I would like to add something if I could, Professor. I wanted to respond to a couple of things that Professor Nelson
Yeah, it's all yours.
Said. Thanks very much. So one of the things I think Professor Nelson said was that he didn't think the federal government should be requiring certain things of Columbia University. And I just want to be very clear that, as I said kind of at the outset, that we think the reforms we're proposing at Columbia and we'll be proposing at other universities can be made in a way that ensure fidelity to the First Amendment and the protection of academic freedom. I would point out, however, that there is a very clear difference in the law between the government coming in and just imposing a condition as part of giving federal funding to an organization or to an institution of higher education, and the federal government coming in a civil rights enforcement role, where it has found a violation of Title VI, and the government can then impose prophylactic requirements as a remedy for that violation. That's very different. And the government frequently will impose remedial requirements to address a civil rights violation that would not necessarily be required of an entity had they not first engaged in the civil rights violation. And I think with respect to Columbia, we are very much in that latter category. There seems to have been very clear Title VI violations on the campus. And so the government has a role in dictating things to remedy those violations, where the government wouldn't necessarily have a role in making similar requirements of a university that didn't engage in a violation of Title VI. And then there were also a couple other things I wanted to address. So with respect to the First Amendment and speech on campus, I think it's important to remember that no right is absolute. There's no absolute right to freedom of speech in the First Amendment. The Supreme Court has imposed some limitations. And when you're looking at the civil rights laws, intent is relevant. So, Professor Nelson talked about social media posts by students and faculty. The First Amendment allows them to post pretty much whatever they want, as long as it's not threatening. However, if there is evidence that the environment on a campus has become hostile to the extent that it then violates Title VI, that type of language is relevant to proving intent. So as a lawyer trying to prove a Title VI violation, evidence that people in leadership at the university have used racial slurs or have used anti-Semitic slurs, that then becomes relevant evidence of their intent to violate Title VI. It's not that it's not protected First Amendment speech, but it is speech that's relevant to commit intent to commit a civil rights violation. And then just the last thing I would say in response to some things that Professor Nelson said is that there has been credible public reporting from the intelligence community that money from Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah has flowed to some of these universities and to some of these student groups at universities. That is a problem under the law. And there's also credible evidence that at least at Columbia, certain students were aware of October 7th before it happened. And that also is clearly a problem. So those are just the things I wanted to say in response to Professor Nelson. I largely agreed with all of his comments. I just wanted to point out a couple of nuanced responses. Thanks.
No,
Yeah,
that's
let me just say briefly in response that I agree that Columbia is in violation of Title VI, and that creates special responsibilities for the federal government. It's just that based on my and I did say that of the 9 recommendations, I thought 5 of them were exactly on point and fine. 2 of them I just felt were too vague. For example, the demand that Columbia reform its admissions procedures, but there were no details about what they really wanted. And so I just didn't feel it had to be substantive, not so vague and broad as that for it to really operate. And I felt that two transgressed on Columbia's independent rights to make its decisions within the domain of academic freedom, even though if Columbia had decided that they would simply close down the Middle East Studies program and not let it open again for another 50 years, I would have applauded the decision. I think the Middle East Studies program is itself in violation of Title VI. I just think that that in that area, the university has to retain its independence. By the way, I will add the single most controversial thing that I could say this afternoon, which is I thought that the federal government was exactly right to go after Columbia's funding. The only way that you will get universities to actually address the problem of anti-Semitism is if they believe it will cost them money if they don't. This is capitalism. I don't think there's anything else. They're not going to have firing squads at dusk, so I think going after the money is the only practical way to get campus administrators to really listen. And I thought it was great that they did that. And although I would also hope that if Columbia reforms itself, the funding is restored. Because I am convinced that the funding cuts are going to do real damage to research at Columbia and at Harvard and other schools where funding cuts are proposed. But without the threat, those administrations, either they're going to do nothing or they'll do what my own administration has done in response to an OCR report, and a pretty good OCR report, and that is to promise the world and do nothing. I mean,
So Professor, can I
Yeah.
just jump in for a second? Because I 100% agree with you that some of the demands set forth were vague. And the reason for that is that the task force is in negotiations with Columbia. Those were just initial demands for them to accede to broadly so that we could open negotiations. I 100% agree with you that when we get to the point where we have hammered out a detailed legal document with Columbia, that a lot of those things can't be as vague as they were in the initial letter. So I agree with you, and we are working to address that. And then on your funding point, this is one of the fundamental problems with Title VI enforcement, and it's been this way for 60 years, is that there's frequently a disconnect between the grant of federal funds and the purpose for which those funds are being granted and the bad actions which lead to civil rights violations. And it's why in 60 years, the federal government has never pulled money from somebody under Title VI. We don't want to stop valuable research, and that's certainly not the task force's goal. But I agree with you 100%. The threat of stopping that money and pulling the $400 million that we did pull, it was the only way to get attention for this problem.
And look how much noise it's generated. I mean, it's generated just, howls of anger and anguish across the country. It obviously worked.
Yeah, lots of wailing and gnashing of teeth.
Yeah.
All right, why don't we have about 18 minutes left. So let me go to one of the questions that's in the Q&A, if that's okay. So the first question that was in there was from Fiona. It says, what special challenges do smaller or less funded colleges face in implementing anti-discrimination policies, and how can we as students contribute to uphold these policies effectively? I don't know who wants to take a stab at that one.
Yeah.
Well, I can just say
Sir,
one
I'm going to
thing.
punt to the two of you
Go
because
ahead, Sean.
I am not a university administrator.
What I would say is that based on because I've looked at two kinds of institutions: large research institutions and small liberal arts colleges. Those are really the kinds of institutions that I've focused on over the last few decades. And there's a special problem that small institutions can face, and that is of a comprehensive atmosphere that can be really suffocating for students. It could be a racist atmosphere, it could be an anti-Black atmosphere, it could be an anti-Semitic atmosphere, but in a large institution, there are always places you can escape to. If you're a student in the chemistry department, it might be that no one in the chemistry department ever says much of anything about Israel or about Judaism or anything related to it. So you kind of go there and you don't worry about what happens elsewhere. But it's a small liberal arts college, there really can be no place to escape to. And so I think the hostile atmosphere that can be created at small institutions can actually be much worse than that created at large ones. And therefore, that's a huge special challenge, because the damage you're doing to students is going to be really much more severe and potentially much more long lasting. And on the other hand, they may not be getting a lot of research money that can be pulled from them, though, of course, they're getting student funding.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not sure that I have much to add on that. I mean, I don't know that there's an easy answer to the initial question, which is, how can we as students contribute to uphold these policies effectively? I mean, other than letting the administrators know and letting the people that need to know that this is something that you're concerned about, that seems clear. I also think that trying to get clarity on, and as a student, you could probably you could be part of initiating this conversation, trying to get clarity on what exactly we mean by discrimination, what we mean by hate, yeah, sorry, I'm just looking at the question. How we're actually thinking about all these terms and getting people on the same page is also a conversation that's absolutely worth having. And that would be true for a small campus and for a large campus. Sean, did you want to add anything? I know you said you're not an administrator.
Yeah, I mean, my personal view, not, being an administrator of university, is that, these universities, if they're state funded, they have to comply with the First Amendment, which means, they can't be punishing students for using discriminatory language. I mean, you can't, punish somebody because they make a racist statement. I mean, that's odious, obviously, but protected by the First Amendment. Where it becomes so pervasive that that such language creates a hostile environment, then we move into territory protected by the civil rights laws. My recommendation to every university and to every student would be to just respect the basic limits of the First Amendment, and try to have a little bit thicker skin. I think, to your point earlier, Professor Redstone, I mean, I've been called lots of things in my time, and you try to invoke the sticks and stones adage. Now, when those statements come with conduct, blocking access to part of a campus, or actual threats of harm, then you're in different territory.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. All right, let me go to the next question and we can see who wants to jump in here. How can administrators and faculty work together to foster a campus culture that both robustly protects academic freedom and actively addresses hate speech or discrimination? I don't know if I'm not sure how different this is from the first question. Obviously, this is on a lot of people's minds. Do either of you have anything that you want to build on?
Well, I would simply say the simplest thing to say is that although people can say whatever they want at a public university because of the First Amendment, it doesn't mean that they can't be criticized for saying some things. So when a faculty member or a staff member or a student makes a clearly racist comment or publishes a racist statement, there's really no reason why the campus administration can't use the educational process to point out why that statement is misguided, why the statement is destructive to the campus environment, and use it as an educational opportunity. In other words, the First Amendment doesn't mean you have to keep your mouth shut if you think that someone has said something that's really destructive. That doesn't mean punishing them is something else. The First Amendment protects against state sanctions for speech, but it doesn't mean you can't call the speech dreadful and try to educate people about why it's wrong. And why it's destructive. That's an educational function that universities, if they can't exercise it, who else on earth could?
Yeah.
No,
Go ahead.
sorry. I 100% agree. I mean, I'm sure I'm not quoting it accurately, but the answer to bad speech is more good speech.
Yeah, okay. I think that makes a lot of sense. I guess I think better with concrete examples. And so when I hear Professor Nelson, when I hear you talk about an example of racist speech, and then the university should talk about what that means for the culture, the way my brain works is I want to think in terms of an example. I don't know if you have something in the back of your mind that you want to share.
Well, I think that if you say, as a faculty member back east did, that all the black students in the College of Law are inferior to the white students, that
You're Amy Wax. Okay.
Amy Wax, I debated her on stage briefly about this, and when she was taken out of a required course, she could continue to teach, but it was decided, her dean decided, that she couldn't teach a course that Black law students were required to take. She said it violated her academic freedom. I said I thought it was the right decision, that Black students shouldn't have to sit in a course where they'd be graded by her, and a course they were required to take if she had made public statements that Black students were always second rate in her college. So I thought it was a very reasonable decision that didn't violate her academic freedom. And I would have said it didn't violate her free speech. She could still say that stuff. It just had some consequences, mainly that she couldn't teach a required course, which I thought was a very reasonable consequence that I think could have been used at a public institution as well. To any public institution where she made that remark, she could face professional consequences. Now, I've gone further because I've said that racist statements, anti-Semitic statements could play a role in tenure decisions and in hiring decisions. In other words, at crucial points in a career where you're making a decision about a faculty member's future, I think that all kinds of statements and interventions that a faculty member has made could go into your decision-making process. They're all part of deciding whether you want to keep that person on campus. And again, I'm breaking the views of my former organization, the AAUP, which holds a quite different opinion on that matter. So I think even in a public institution, when you're making basic personnel decisions, highly destructive personal statements on the part of a candidate can have an impact on the decision you make, and that doesn't constitute violating First Amendment rights to decide that that person just shouldn't be a member of your community any longer. But that's more than a little controversial, shall we say?
Yeah. No, I mean, but it's helpful to hear your thoughts on that. I don't remember, honestly, I don't remember the specifics enough of what exactly Amy Wax said. So I'm hesitant to sort of do a deep dive into that because I really don't remember the specifics of what she said. I can imagine different versions of comments around that topic, some of which would be more objectionable than others. And I don't remember exactly what she said. So I will just leave your comments and take your word for it for now. Okay, let's go to another question here. What are some of the most urgent legal, cultural, or educational interventions needed to reverse the recent surge in anti-Semitic incidents in the United States? The most urgent legal, cultural, or educational interventions.
I mean, I can jump in
Great.
with the legal interventions. I mean, I think it's imperative that the federal government, as it is doing through the task force of which I'm a member, vigorously enforce Title VI of the '64 Act. In terms of educational interventions, I would defer to Professors Nelson and Redstone.
Yeah, I mean, for me, for the educational interventions, I would say on the cultural and educational side, it's sort of what I said before, which is really rethinking how we are talking and communicating with students about the most contentious issues, particularly politically contested claims, and acknowledging and being upfront about the fact that those claims are politically contested, and the sort of the judgments and conclusions that derive from those claims when they're presented as definitive. I mean, I really think that requires rethinking from sort of the top down, bottom up, both probably. And that would be kind of educational and cultural. Professor Nelson.
Well, we're in a situation in which people think that some politically contested claims are adjudicable as absolute truths, and they believe that they're in possession of the absolute truth regarding what are contestable political claims. So I think that Ilana, you're right, that needs to be thought through very clearly, and that kind of distinction made.
Okay, we probably have time for one more question, which is great because we have one more question. Beyond immediate disciplinary measures, what long-term or preventative initiatives, such as curriculum changes or ongoing community dialogue, do you see as critical to reducing anti-Semitism in education environments?
Well, knowledge about what anti-Semitism is and also what anti-Semitism has been for more than 2,000 years, that's certainly hugely helpful because a lot of hateful beliefs, whether they're anti-Semitic, racist, Islamophobic, are pretty much grounded in considerable ignorance. And I like to believe that knowledge helps dispel ignorance. But that's an illusion, but it's guided my life, so I'll hold on to it. So that's I think the first step is to really uh, in, improve the curriculum, make sure that knowledge about anti-Semitism is built into a variety of courses, make sure that knowledge about Jewish culture, because all of the positive features of Jewish culture that are also invisible to most students, be part of appropriate courses so that an atmosphere of knowledge be created. But I also think we have to think more seriously about teaching students about productive dialogue, teaching students about how to agree and disagree, teaching students, reminding them how to listen to one another. I think the conduct, how debate is conducted on campus needs to be reformed and revived and revised. Not that there aren't plenty of models for doing it in a rational and respectful way, but they need to be revived on campus. In the spring 24 encampments, the April and May encampments, there really were few invitations to dialogue. In fact, people mostly felt that they possessed the absolute truth about what Professor Redstone was identifying as politically contested subjects. And that in a sense, violated the whole concept of a university, which is supposed to be a place to debate and analyze and discuss issues that are in fact not resolved. So what we needed in one part was the simple return to the openness and willingness to listen to different opinions, to discuss different points of view, to consider factual evidence, all of those things that are fundamental to a university. None of them are surprising, none of them are original, but they are the basis on which we can best conduct our business.
No, thanks for that. Did you want to add anything, Sean?
No, I have a meeting that's starting exactly 6 o'clock, so
Oh,
I need
okay.
to sign off. So I
No,
just wanted to thank everybody for the conversation and thank
thank
all
you.
the attendees. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
Professor Nelson, did you want to sort of offer any last words or thoughts on this topic?
Um, I would say one of the things which didn't come up so far, which is that each of the major prejudices that we face is unique. Each of them has a unique history. Anti-Black racism in the United States is deeply embedded in our culture. It's a formative conviction. It's a social wound that goes back for hundreds of years, and it needs to be considered with all of its unique history. Anti-Semitism is also a quite distinctive, quite different phenomenon. I also think it's pretty embedded in our culture, but it doesn't have the structural embeddedness that anti-Black racism does. In the United States, Islamophobia is a problem, but much less of a problem than anti-Black racism or anti-Semitism. And so I think it's a mistake when colleges or universities say you have to treat each of these three phenomena in exactly the same way, because they aren't the same. They have different history, they have different contexts, and I think they each need to be addressed in their unique status.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So I know Sean, before he ducked off, he just wanted to thank everybody for being here. And I do too. I want to thank everyone for listening to us. And I know this is an important topic that people are thinking about. Um, I know Professor Nelson is able to stay on for a little bit if people continue to have questions. I also have to duck out. But I will leave it to Professor Nelson and to our hosts, the World Salon, and I will offer my thanks as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great to have a chance to talk with you.
Thank you.